Welcome to the Steve Funds Families Healing Together community conversation. We're so excited that you're here to join us this evening. My name is Dr. Gina Duncan. I'm an adult psychiatrist based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussion. We would love to hear from you, so feel free to note in the chat where you're tuning in from, ask questions, and share your stories in the chat. Joining us this evening are our three very esteemed speakers: Shanila Sattar, founder of Flow Breathwork Facilitator Training; Regina Crider, Executive Director of Youth and Family Peer Support Alliance; and Dr. Josephine Kim, Senior Lecturer on Education at Harvard Graduate School of Education and licensed mental health counselor. Welcome to our panelists. So to get us started off tonight, there is a quote that we wanted to lead off with. And that quote is, "I always try to remember that I'll be the best me I can be if I prioritize myself." And that's by Michelle Obama. I love that quote. It really resonates with me. Shanila, let's start with you. What does caring for oneself mean to you?
I love that question. It can be so many different things, but I think at the root of it is being kind to myself, being nice to myself, being gentle with myself. And I think, in the world of self-care and wellness and health, there's so many different options and there's so many things you can pick that is under the self-care category that is technically caring for yourself. But at the root of it, am I actually being nice? Am I being kind? Am I monitoring my own energy? Am I pushing myself? Am I bullying myself in the things that I say in my head? Am I forcing? And in all the ways that you can think about caring, it's mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual in all the ways.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think that's so very true. And Regina, this next question is going to be directed to you. We talk about self-care a lot, especially these days. But why is self-care so difficult to practice? Or is it just difficult in theory? I think that's one of the questions that we have. I was hoping you might be able to tell us about your own self-care journey and how supporting your teens' mental health diagnoses and symptoms has impacted you personally, and ways that you release stress and tend to yourself in that context.
So I find that self-care is difficult if you don't know yourself. And if you are not in tune with yourself, what you like, what you don't like, what you need, even how much you need or don't need. My daughter's journey, which I'm at full, have permission to discuss. I always get permission from her to talk about her journey. It forced me to deal with my own mental health, and it required me to address my own self-care needs. A lot of times parents who are navigating systems for their children, frequently their children's mental health will trigger their mental health. And so in the work that I do as a peer supporter, I'm always giving out advice to other parents. Hey, you need to do this, you need to do that, so that you can stay engaged and stay in the hunt. But guess what? I was terrible at taking my own advice about good self-care. And so my healthcare, my mental health, my self-care journey was hit and miss for a lot of years, because I was great at giving advice, but I wasn't so great at taking my own advice. But what I discovered is as my daughter got older, her crises got more intense, where we ended up in the hospital for weeks on end, and that was causing me more stress. I still had another child at home that I was caring for, so my mental health was getting off the charts as well. And so I had to take my own advice. And one of the things that I do for myself personally is that I pray, I meditate, I read scriptures. Those things are very, give me a lot of hope, give me a lot of strength. And next week I'll be turning 50. So now I'm adding on some extra stuff for my self-care as well. And that includes, taking care of my physical health, like eating better. I would say exercise, but I'm not going to. So I'm going to say moving my body more, right? Because exercise is like not one of my favorite words. And like Shanila just said, not forcing myself into doing things that is not, make me feel good about myself. And then also I've started a supplement journey, which has been very exciting as well. So I remind myself that not taking care of myself is neither heroic or noble in any kind of way, shape, or fashion. It's actually the total opposite of that. And so that's the things that I've done to work on my mental health journey, my self-care journey, with the challenges that, accompany being with my, dealing with my daughter's mental health.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and just that transparency and for sharing that with us. And I love how you put that about not calling it exercise. If the word exercise turns you off, and it turns me off too, moving your body, physical activity. I think those are a lot of ways that we can name it if the word exercise is too much. So thank you very much for sharing that. Let me ask this, coming back to you, Shanila, sometimes it can be hard to vocalize our feelings. But one way that we can do this is through creative practices like journaling, songwriting, drawing, writing poetry, singing, and things like that. How do these kinds of creative practices help us to name and express emotions and to regulate our emotional state? And how can this in turn be a positive model for the young people in our lives when we engage in these practices ourselves?
What an important question. I'll say it from my own experience of being an immigrant person who didn't grow up in the United States. I'm from a South Asian culture. I'm from Bangladesh, and I have a lot of limitations around what kind of mental health conversations feel safe to even have. And even right now, we're in AAPI month, Asian American Pacific Islander month, and you don't really see a lot of AAPI people talking about mental health. And that's kind of the point, that there is not a lot of safety around that type of expression. It's like, oh, stress, drink water, like, oh, emotions, what are those? It's very, it's well-meaning, but it comes from a cultural, there's cultural barriers to that. So for me, when you ask about expressing an expression, I think it's up to our specific own experience and our own generations to figure out what that expression actually means. For some people, it's art. For some people, it's meditation. For some people, it's dancing. Some people, it's drawing. Some people, it's reading. Some people, it's writing. There's so many different other ways to express. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about mindfulness and self-care practices, mindfulness can come from any type of practice. It's not just like a stillness. It's not about like shutting off your mind and saying like, oh, nothing bothers me. I don't have 100 things that are floating through my mind, and I can like go to a cave and a fly sits on my nose and it's not going to bother me. We know that's not true. We have a lot of struggles in that type of expression. So for me, it's really about the things that work for you, what comes to you naturally. So if you're already drawn to certain types of things like walking in nature, you're already drawn to music, you're drawn to putting on your headphones and kind of just like floating away, how can you change the relationship that you have with these activities without it feeling like you are, not being productive, or this is not what you're supposed to be doing right now? Kind of navigating the shift in the way that you think about your activities. And at the end of the day, emotions are energy in motion. Emotion, literally the word stands for energy in motion, like E equals MC squared. Energy. Emotions process through our body physiologically. So when we're not allowing ourselves to let it flow, that's when we have things like, linguistically, we kind of understand that we hold emotions in the body. A heartache is processed at the heart. Burdens on your shoulder is processed at your shoulders. Grief is processed at your lower back. Your intuition, that gut feeling, the feeling in the pit of your stomach, where is that? It's in your stomach. So intuitively, we understand there's so many different ways that our bodies crave to express. And so when you lean into the ways that your body naturally says like, hey, you know what? I kind of want to move. And Regina was saying like exercise. Like, no, don't say the word exercise. Say like, it's a twerkathon. Like we're about to shake it. We're about to like dance in the kitchen. You're still exercising. It's just a different word for it. So I think that reframing becomes really important for us.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I just want to highlight, I mean, the quote, to quote what you just said, there are so many ways to express oneself, and mindfulness can come from any practice. It's not just about stillness. It's about what works well for you. Because I think that when we focus on the idea that mindfulness has to look a certain way, then that makes people feel as though, well, I can't do that. So I don't know that this mindfulness thing is going to work for me. I love that. Regina, do you have anything that you wanted to
I did.
add to that?
When I thought about this question, I thought it was really interesting because I don't personally consider myself a creative person. But when I really started thinking about how do I express myself, I really do it through storytelling. That is my creative expression. In my organization, I'm a parent peer supporter. And as a parent peer supporter, what I do is I support other parents who are navigating systems, children's mental health systems with their child. And we create a connection. And the way that I make that connection is by sharing my lived experience. And that comes through my storytelling of what I've gone through with my daughter, or, how I deal with my own mental health and my own self-care. And I just find that the storytelling gives me freedom. It takes away the stigma, the shame, the judgment. And I think by sharing my story, it helps to empower other people. So that's how I use my creative expression and outlet, is through my peer work of sharing my story with other parents.
Wow, that's so powerful. And yeah, I think you both have given us a lot of really, really great ideas already. I guess we'll move into this next part of our discussion. And this is an area that I think is really important, especially given where we are right now, in the context of the pandemic, in the context of a significant racial stress and trauma that has been occurring in many of our communities in recent years and months, and even recent days. We wanted to turn the focus to a discussion about family dynamics, racial stress, and how those play into our well-being. So Dr. Kim, this question is for you. How do family dynamics and unspoken expectations, especially from a cultural perspective, impact how we connect with our family and with ourselves? And as an additional part to that question, how can we recognize but yet not be completely run by our family dynamics?
Yeah, when we think about mental health of marginalized communities, we do always need to think about two things, in my opinion. One is the external forces that really keep us vulnerable, right? So it's all the racialized, issues that we're dealing with, the trauma and the experience of the discrimination and oppression. But it's also the within community factors. And the family, of course, is one of the main things. It's everything, isn't it? And so, Shanila, you kind of alluded to this, but honestly, as an 80-year-old who immigrated to the US, it didn't take me long to realize that something was wrong with my parents. And really because they express love so differently, right? And I don't know if you can resonate, right? As my American lens was thickening and becoming stronger, I expected very Western ways of being and expressing in my family. And yet that's not what I got, right? Because I come from a collectivist culture where, unity and harmony and the wellness of the family actually is more important than maybe my individual well-being. Not only that, I also come from a family and culture where it's more the high context communication where words are not so necessary. So as my friends, white friends, were hearing things like, I love you, I'm so proud of you, and getting hugs, in my home, none of that was happening, right? And so in my young bicultural mind, I was thinking, my parents don't love me, right? Because I've never heard these words. I don't get the hugs, I don't get the kisses, right? And it took a long time for me to realize these cultural ways of communicating love is just so different family by family, isn't it? Especially coming from my Korean culture, it's not really told explicitly through words, it's told through actions. Right. So my parents would do all sorts of acts of love. And if I didn't have that cultural lens to be able to understand it, then I would have always said they don't love me. Right. But now that I understand these cultural nuances, I certainly see where there's an abundance of love. But you can imagine if we don't talk about these cultural differences, though, how kids can really miss out on a whole lot or think they miss out on a whole lot, right? Because the deep love and the bond is there. It's just not communicated in the ways that we might expect sometimes. And so, how does this all relate to kind of how we see ourselves, how we connect to families? I think because there isn't that explicit verbal communication sometimes that we're expecting from an American lens, it can feel isolating, I would say, especially when language barriers come into play. I would say, secondly, that these expectations that are not spoken oftentimes create even more pressure, maybe even a burden, because we also see that our families, especially when there are families coming from a migration history, we know all of that involves trauma. We're talking deep grief and loss where they've cut off ties, right? Said goodbye to families and friends, said goodbye to familiarity. They're trying to fit into a host culture now where there are thick barriers and there's oppression here. So you can imagine how all of those things are weighing on not only the parents, but definitely communicated in, verbal and nonverbal ways to the child. And so I would say when we say, how can we recognize but not be run by family dynamics? One, let's recognize there's a huge cultural component, right? And so I always advise young people, think with your cultural lens, listen with your cultural lens, try to look at things with your cultural lens because you might see things and hear things differently. And then secondly, sometimes we have to ask our parents what it is that we need and do it in the most honoring and respectful way. I remember my father and I would just always clash because of these cultural differences. And it really took my building a relationship with him and then being able to say in the most respectful and honoring way, Dad, in these moments, this is what I need from you, and literally giving him a script. And I will never forget the day when my father dropped everything he was doing and he literally took my script and said it to me. Wow, that must have been difficult for you. And what it showed me in that moment was, wow, he's never had sort of a model or an example, right, to see himself. And he never had this practice. Remember, a skill is a skill only when you've practiced it. So we talk about self-care, but it's not self-care until you've practiced it, made it your own, and it becomes a skill, right? And so same thing with communication.
Wow, you've said so much there that there's so many areas that I wanted to go to kind of go back to, but I think you gave us another excellent quote, which is a skill is not a skill until it's been practiced, or a skill is just a skill, is not, until it's been practiced. And then what a beautiful example of the communication between you and your dad, and just the cultural lens through which we have to see things. Regina, was there anything you'd like to add on to that, and any thoughts?
When I was thinking about this from the mental health standpoint and what I've gone through and dealing with it with my daughter, we know, if we're honest, well-meaning, misinformed family members and their expectations can keep us from our healing journey to our pathway of healing. And I was so embarrassed by my daughter's behavior because in a Black family, children are to behave, and we don't do the things that my daughter was doing. She was having full-fledged meltdowns, hollering, screaming, and she was aggressive. We just didn't do that. And she was, very different from my son. And so I was making excuses. Oh, she's tired. She didn't sleep well last night. She's spoiled. She's a strong-willed child. Yeah, all those things were true, but the foundational truth was that she was anxious, depressed, and she was autistic. And so I really had to shift the paradigm. It was a paradigm shift in my family about acceptance, accepting her for who she is and this journey that she's on. And this is not about fixing her. This was not about making her behave. This was not about making her live up to these standard and cultural practices that I was accustomed to. You give a child a look back in the day and it was clam up and, scurry off to a corner. Me growing up, children were not, if we wanted you to have emotions, we would give you emotions. And so we didn't give you those. And so you don't have the right to have any. And I just couldn't do that to her because I was deathly afraid of her becoming a statistic if that's what I did. And so my family had to get on board with what we needed to do. I was breaking down the barriers. We're not doing this. I don't care about, putting on pretenses of what it needs to look like. This is the reality. And my child, I said this to my parents. I said, if she had leukemia, she had cancer, she had, some physical ailment, everybody would be on board with the treatment of how to deal with this. There would be no questions asked. But because this is a mental health situation, there's this, oh, you're just reading books and you're just listening to everything that these doctors are telling you. And, all you need to do is what? Whoop her butt. Yeah, no, that doesn't work. Because if that worked, we would have resolved this issue some time ago. So in essence, you sometimes you just have to break away from the family expectations. And that was one of the things that we really had to do in our family.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. And I think that kind of then leads to the next question I was going to ask, because we've talked about with the intra-family dynamic, but now thinking about the broader context in which we live in our communities and in our society. So Dr. Kim, this question is for you. What is the relationship between racial stress, racial trauma, and tending to oneself or self-care?
Oh my gosh. I mean, the relationship is that when there's racial stress and racial trauma, you need to tend to yourself more, right? Because it is wearing you down. I mean, and, let me also put up there that when we talk about racial trauma, when something directly happens to you, that creates a trauma, but also vicarious trauma and secondary trauma is just as real. Watching people who look like me being stabbed multiple times, I can tell you, is traumatic for me, right? And what we know about racial trauma and other sorts of trauma is that it really becomes encoded into our DNA. It changes our physiology. Well, is it any wonder then we have physical manifestations of that trauma, right? So the anxiety we're seeing that are off the charts, the depression, all of it is manifesting oftentimes, especially in different cultural contexts. It comes out physically. And Shanila, you talked about this earlier too, where the anxiety, right, again, is off the charts and is coming out physically. But that's the thing that we need to focus on. What's the relationship? It means that we need to tend to ourselves more. So we can't approach this as just wait till something happens and then you try to engage your mental health. It has to be approached as mental health hygiene. Nobody ever says, I haven't brushed in a week, right? But the next 72 hours, I'm going to brush all day long. We just don't do that. Why? Because we take 2 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes at night to make sure we brush our teeth. And what does that do? It keeps the cavities away. Same thing when we approach mental health, that's exactly what we need to do. Engage in mental health hygiene, where you're routinely purging, right, these toxic emotions, right? Externalizing emotions, externalizing these types of things. And also for us in marginalized communities, recognize that it's going to manifest physically, meaning your appetite might change, your sleep patterns might change, you might feel lethargic. These are all signs that are pointing to some sort of psychological issue, especially if it's prolonged. I also want to say that when there's emotional pain, the same area of our brain that's activated by physical pain, that's the same area that too is triggered by emotional pain. It is just as real, just as debilitating, and deserving of our attention. Right?
Yeah, such excellent and salient points. And I think that actually it's a perfect segue into this next section that we wanted to talk about, which is, we're going to have this conversation about self-care. Let's talk about some practical self-care strategies. It's one thing to name strategies, but if they're not practical and they can't really be incorporated into our daily life, they're not of much use to us. So, Regina, I want to ask you this, the idea that self-care, it's especially for those of us who come from collectivist cultures. And I love, Dr. Kim, that you use that term, which most minority cultures in the US are collectivist cultures. And so the idea that our self-care is not just for us alone, it's also so that we can be connected as a community, be healthy in our family units and our communities. So Regina, what are some practical tips that we could take away to prioritize self-care so that we can support ourselves and also the young people of color who are in our lives?
I have 3 tips, and Shanila mentioned this at the beginning. Be kind to yourself. I mean, that's the biggest, I think, self-care tip that you can extend yourself. Being kind to yourself is being gracious, being merciful, being gentle, being even forgiving towards yourself. That is one of the biggest things that you could do as far as self-care, because self-care is a journey. I have found that, what I was doing when I was 30 looks very different at 50. And it's not going to always look the same. And so with that, the second tip is explore what self-care looks like for you, right? As women, and I'm not excluding men, but just because of the group that's here, oftentimes we're like, oh, let's go get pedicures and manicures and let's get a massage that's not self-care to me. That's maintenance, right? Okay. I feel like that's something that I have to do and I need to do. But for some folks, that is good self-care. But if that's not your self-care thing, find your thing that really works for you. One of the areas with dealing with parents that I'm working with, they have like so many different levels of issues that they're dealing with. And one self-care tip that I always offer parents, especially those that are struggling, are if paying your bills on time is going to help keep your stress levels down, then that is good self-care, is to pay your bills on time, right? If making a grocery list before you go to the grocery store is going to help take away, if you're anything like me, you hate shopping. I hate shopping with a passion. Go in armed with a grocery list so that it's not as stressful. It's little things. It doesn't have to be big, grandiose things for good self-care. And then also the last thing is model good self-care. That's one of the biggest things for me as a mother for my daughter, because I know the challenges that she faces ahead of her, is to be an advocate for self-care, but modeling it for her, because when she's 25, when she's 30, when she's 35, I want her to know how to do this for herself and not trying to figure it out on her own. My mother's first self-care tip, and has always been her only self-care tip for me, was, well, if you buy yourself a tube of lipstick every pay period, it'll make you feel better. And I'm like, yeah, nah, Mom, that's not going to make me feel better. But that was her way of trying to teach me about self-care. So the point is let's model it at school, at home, at work, in the community. Let's talk about it. It's critical to really start talking about self-care.
Yeah, such great points. My great aunt had a saying, children learn what they live. And so I think that it's not just what we say, it's what we do and what they observe us doing that is so powerful and will make that impact. Shanila, do you have anything to add to those thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So doubling down on everything, ditto for what Regina said. And to double down on the last bit about the dialogue, I think that's what opens up the possibilities for people to even feel safe in talking about self-care and normalizing mental health, normalizing issues, normalizing not feeling love, light, and joy all the time, normalizing just having like regular human problems on the day-to-day. And I think when we're talking about youth, and specifically youth of color, we're talking about representation, but what does that actually mean to have representation? Does that mean just, magazines and pictures and seeing visuals of other people? Or does that also mean the dialogue that we're hearing coming from from people who are marginalized or underrepresented. So when we open up that dialogue, we give more safety. And I think safety is a huge part of what gives us permission to practice anything. We feel like, yeah, it's okay because I see like these aunties talking about it, and I see like these aunties practicing, and I see like my dad doing this and that. So that modeling kind of doubles down, because it's not just the behavior that people are looking at, it's also the dialogue. It's just what's playing in the background. What kind of language are you hearing? What kind of kindness are you practicing with the way that you're approaching the practices that you have? And when we're talking about like collective self-care in that sense, it's all about seeing each other being able to practice. So maybe it's not in your family dynamics, but just people from your community who are like making taking a brave choice and saying like, you know what, I'm gonna do yoga even though everybody in my family said it was woo woo wah wah, or I'm gonna like take a dance class even though like I don't resonate with myself as a dancer. You start to kind of break through the boundaries because you have more representation in the doing and being able to speak about stuff.
Yeah, again, excellent points. And actually, Shanila, I'm going to come back to you for this next question. How can cultural and or spiritual practices be incorporated into self-care? Because for so many of us, our cultural practices and often those spiritual practices are linked with our cultural practices are very important to us. So do you have any suggestions or ways in which that
Yeah,
can be done?
I think having a human approach first is like, we're people at the end of the day, and we're not just made of one thing. So it's not just even our mental health, even though if we're just talking about mental health, I think, Josephine and Regina mentioned earlier, like everything is interconnected. So if we're talking about spiritual health, that 100% is reflected from your physical health, which is 100% reflected from how you're doing emotionally and how you're doing mentally, how you're doing financially, all of these different things, how you're doing socially, all of these different things are constantly informing each other. So if we're trying to say like, okay, these are the spiritual practices, it's about you looking at yourself from all of these different things, the integrative perspective, the holistic perspective, the whole person perspective. So some of us are really good at having, like we know the physical part. We know we have to do this and this and that. We have that regime that does this, but like we don't know how to talk. We don't know how to communicate. We don't know how to like express like, I didn't like that, or this is my boundary. And that manifests in the body. That manifests as that feeling that I don't feel safe to express. So now you're going to have a mental issue from that too, because now you're going to overthink about something that you weren't able to express. So everything is being, informed by each other. So practically what that means is that maybe you can take some kind of inventory and you make categories of the different types of health that exist in your life. So category for mental health, category for emotional health, category for physical health, category for financial health. I know we don't want to talk about it. Category for social health, like who are your friends? And then you start to see like, wow, I actually don't have any deposits in my social health category. I don't have anything in my social health because like I'm always exercising, I'm always like getting my bag, and like, financially I'm doing great, but I don't have a support system. And that impacts how you feel and how supported you feel. So, doing an inventory like that is going to change the way you approach your well-being.
Well, with that in mind, could you lead us, Shanila, in a stress busting exercise? And we know that you do a lot of breath work. So we were hoping that you could, maybe lead us in a breath work exercise.
Absolutely. And my breathwork book came out yesterday. So, shout out to me. But I'm going to share a breathing technique that is for stress reducing. And you can do this anytime, whether you're sitting or laying down. It's an all day kind of situation. So it's not just like for any part of the day. And it's called the 6-7-8 breath. And what it does is it gets your body into something known as the parasympathetic nervous state. This is where you get to rest, relax, digest, your immunity kicks up, your digestion kicks up, all the feel-good hormones are kicking up as well. And it's super simple. So essentially what you do is you breathe in for 6 seconds, you hold your breath for 7 seconds, and you exhale for 8 seconds. 6, 7, 8. So go ahead. You can close down your eyes. You can wiggle your shoulders. Just find your comfy seat and take a deep breath in through your nose and exhale out your mouth. Let go. And in through your nose, start to breathe in for 6 seconds. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold this breath for 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And exhaling from your mouth for 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Breathe in deeply into your nose and exhale out your mouth. There you go.
Thank you so much. I feel very relaxed, and it's amazing how just one round of that, I feel relaxed after just one round, and so I can only imagine what repeated practice and time can do. So thank you so much, Shanila, for leading us in that. We would love, now I'm turning to our audience, we'd love to hear what you've thought so far about our event. Please share your thoughts in our survey. And while you're doing that, we would like to open up the floor to our audience to ask some questions. So please use the chat to ask our speakers any questions that you have. Again, I want to thank our speakers so much. And yes, please type your comments and questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. While we're waiting, I want to come back to you real quick, Shanila, to ask you, in terms of the breath work, that exercise, is there a particular way that you would recommend doing that, or is there a certain number of repetitions, multiple times of day, other things that you would kind of recommend with that exercise?
Yeah, great question. And, different styles of breathing do different things. And the nice thing about this one is that it's so versatile. You can keep doing this. Some people do this for an hour long, like a full breathwork session. Some people, it's like, yeah, I just need to, calm, relax, chill my body. If you're feeling anxious, if you're about to go give a speech, if you're driving. So it doesn't require you to necessarily have a lot of stillness. You can be doing this breath as you're like in a meeting. So yeah, there's no limitations to that. And that's what makes it so awesome.
Great. Awesome. Well, Dr. Kim, coming back to you, there was we were talking about the cultural and spiritual practices and incorporating those into self-care. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Sure. I was going to add, for cultures that don't really see therapy or counseling as an option, because oftentimes we would say, if you're experiencing these things, like, of course, you should go and get some professional help. For cultures that are not so used to that, because after all, that is a very Western model we're presenting to them, right? I'm really learning to elevate, having therapeutic conversations without therapy. Essentially, we do this quite a bit actually in the kitchen side by side. We're engaged in some cooking activity with our mom, let's say, and you begin to just have a therapeutic conversation. Want you to know that too is very effective in our self-care. And I think the other piece about, especially related to the racial trauma and everything that's happening now, I think a big part of self-care for marginalized groups is to find a way to activism that makes sense for you, where we can take all of this angst and the anxiety and the hurt and the pain and the wound, and where we can channel that into something productive where we feel like we're actually contributing to the solution, right? And so for me, for example, my self-care during these times is that activism. And my activism really is education, right? So the many times that I'm educating, I see that as my activism. I see my language as my weapon now, right? And so those are ways that I also engage in self-care, and it makes a lot of sense for me and makes me feel good about, the fact that I'm contributing in the ways that I can in making the world a little better, at least within my circle of influence.
Yeah, I agree with you so much. And I think that, particularly when I'm talking with patients in my practice and talking or with my family and thinking for myself, one of the things that is so difficult about these times is the feeling of powerlessness that can come over us when we're watching these tragedies unfold. And so finding ways to be active or to engage our activism. But I love the way that you put that activism doesn't it can take many different forms. So there's certainly there's a role of getting out in the street and protesting. And we tend to think of that, I think, when we think about activism, but education and conversation and there are lots of other ways of activism. So I love that you brought that up. Regina, I'm curious, do you have any thoughts about that yourself?
I think I agree. I agree with that. I don't have anything specific right now.
Okay. Well, we have a question from a member of our audience. The question is, for those of us with older relatives that aren't familiar or comfortable with these practices, how can we approach these conversations and practices with them? And I'll just open that up to the floor.
I'm happy to.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm happy to kind of give my 2 cents around that. You know, when we're talking about these breathwork practices, one of my biggest intentions of creating something was so that my parents could use it. You know, my parents who never have practiced breathwork techniques, and now my mom comes to like Sunday night breathwork class, you know, and she's like doing all these different things. And it's about making it super simplified without all these different like contexts around like, ooh, this is the science behind it, and this is the spirituality behind it, and this is like the trauma healing. This is going to make you a better person. You know, like whether like without, you know, putting all the context of what you think it's going to do for somebody, you just give them the tool. The tool is breathe in for 6, hold your breath for 7, and exhale for 8. Whatever that elicits within you is now for you to process. So I think start simple.
I would agree with
Great.
that. For my mom and my dad, it was, like I said, they consider themselves very old school. And for me, I really had to appeal to their heart about what we needed to do to support my daughter with her mental health journey, because it started off really scary. She was in the elementary school and she tried to hang herself at school. And so to call my mom and tell her that, she just couldn't wrap her mind around it. And so I spent a lot of time educating my parents about children's mental health, because they couldn't quite understand, how could a child have such issues at this age that they would want to do something like that. So I likened it onto some of the family members, older family members that we had with mental health problems. I said, those mental health issues didn't just start in adulthood. Those were things that were happening in their childhood that may have gone untreated. And so it has just progressed to what it is now. I said, what we want to do with her is start early on learning coping skill, mindfulness, you know, educating. And so one of the things that I did with my family as a whole is that we all went to the youth mental health first aid training. And that was really a big deal for our family, because my parents were introduced to the seriousness of suicide. They were hearing the statistics, they were hearing the stories, but then they were introduced to the terminology of being in mental health recovery. And so when I talked to my mom, my family about that, she understands what that means. And, you know, what are we doing to help Diana stay in recovery, help my daughter stay in recovery? And she can understand it. But it took us going through some educational things to be able to do that.
Yeah. We have another question. And Dr. Kim, I'll give this one to you. What does healing together mean to you?
You know, for me, it means sitting in the pain together. You know, so it doesn't mean that we have solutions. It doesn't mean that we need to act and do something. Sometimes it really is just kind of being with each other and sitting in the pain together. And sometimes that means in silence. But there's something so relieving about knowing that it's not just you, isn't there? Yeah.
Definitely. And then I think we have time for one last question. For the people who prefer other terms besides self-care, do our panelists have any other words or concepts to use instead?
For me, it's not human beings or human doings, but it's human beings, right? So how do I learn to be, and how do I optimize myself? Because that's when I know I can do my best work.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, we are just so happy that everyone joined us tonight. And we wanted to close with this quote that I just love. You are worth the quiet moment. You are worth the deeper breaths, and you are worth the time it takes to slow down, be still, and rest. It's Morgan Harper Nichols. Great questions from our audience. Thank you to our panelists. My cup certainly has been filled tonight, and I hope the same is true for everyone. Again, we are very appreciative and say a very big thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the Steve Fund. We also want to note and as well that this event tonight is part of MTV's Mental Health Action Day. And so wanted to let everyone know that as well. And thank you to our audience who took the time to join us tonight. We hope that you've gotten something out of this for yourselves, for your families, for your community. For more family-friendly resources, please visit the Steve Fund's Family Corner. The website is going to be posted in the chat, but it's stevefund.org/familycorner. And again, thank you so much to everyone. Be well and have a great evening.